Alrighty, we're on the air. Grandmaster Chris, Kitten Shark, as it were, teacher of mine, has confronted me with questions that I haven't heard yet. He wants to talk about some stuff, and so here we are. Chris,
Yes.
it's all you.
Yeah, so I like to watch shows like Survivor, which basically entail a kind of social game, a lot of like people trying to influence each other to, come to their side and vote each other out. And a book that's often what? Do you want to say anything?
Oh no.
Okay. And a book that is often brought up by fans of that show is called The 48 Laws of Power. And I found that in this like free preview of it that I got in the iBook store, what it says in the preface of the book, I think is very relevant um, in terms of issues of psychology and gift theory because I think it does a good job of illustrating. Well, maybe you could say it only asserts or illustrates, maybe supports the idea that basically, um, in the fallen world, the default is that
Yo,
everyone.
dude,
What?
breaking up.
We're breaking up.
We're breaking up just a bit there. Repeat that last sentence. Hopefully, you won't break up as much.
Okay. Yeah. So the preface, at least as I kind of interpret, I mean, obviously, the author isn't meaning to say something like this, but basically, it shows that in the fallen world, in like the fallen state of humanity, it's basically like the underlying basic state of things is that it's every person for themselves, and we're all kind of competing against one another to try to um, enforce our own kind of justice, over and against someone else's. Um, and yeah, that's basically, as well as I can articulate right now what I think the interest in the preface is, and it might illustrate itself more as I read it. So, for those of you who, maybe have um, seen the laws of power that are in the book, it's not pleasant all the time. It can get, the author Robert Greene talks about, it being amoral. He's not really concerned with like traditional um, ideas of right and wrong, because as far as he's concerned, like it's a game. It's like, life is kind of a game where everyone is trying, even if they're not really admitting it, they're trying to have power over other people. And as far as he's concerned, you may as well, you know, be better at it than be worse at it. Now, as far as I understand gift theory, um, that is kind of the alternative to that. Um, that God kind of allows us um, to act on. The alternative to this, what I'm about to read. And I guess one other thing that I think I should bring up as a kind of preface is New Apologetics' basic, I guess, explanation of original sin. Basically, it says in the Catechism that in original justice, if humans didn't sin, there was, an order of justice in the human sphere where every a man was confirmed in every like aspect. So everyone's desires would be consistent with everyone else's desires, and they would all be fulfilled. Um, and there would be no suffering, no physical death, nothing. There'd be like natural disasters, but maybe they like conveniently avoid people's houses or something like that. Um, if it's like a tornado or something. But once our first parents sinned, they introduced an element of disorder into the world, that which is contrary to what God intended. And that disorder created a kind of ripple effect where, we're not in the kind of situation that God intended, and that God created our psyches for. So we were created, the biggest example is we were created to have our desires and everyone else's desires to be fulfilled. But since we're in a world where that's not really possible all the time, since we're made to want to be well, it influences us to act selfishly for our desires over against anyone else's. So that's basically how, according to apologetics, how the desire to sin kind of originates. Anything else you want to say about that before we get into it?
Just a point about that last point. It's close what you said to the analysis that New Apologetics would offer. More specifically, it's not that a person would be so much inclined to be selfish as such, according to the common sense definition of selfish, but rather that a person is, because of the disorder in the world now, confronted with double binds in more or less every decision. And it seems because of the double binds that you have to choose one horn of a dilemma or another in any given proceeding. And because of that, I've chosen A. So therefore, because I've chosen A, not A, I have to really choose against not A, even though not A had some good in it, some good that I now can't quite afford to recognize as good, you see. So in being confronted with a double bind like that, I'm ipso facto seemingly forced to set one good against another. And this is where all kinds of nightmarish things come from. So it could be selfishness in the sense of, what we understand typically by that, like, grabbing at some desire over against somebody else's, or it could be a kind of, less evident form of selfishness in the form of, say, people pleasing, where you subvert your own desires for someone else's, but not in a manner of charity or willed beneficence, but rather, to avoid the threat of what will happen to you if you don't do that kind of submission. And it's really a kind of selfishness when you look at it more closely, but it's not an evident kind of selfishness. And people pick different roads depending on the resources that are available to them at the time, or the types of double binds they're confronted with. And it sets up a rig psychologically from that point on, and it's very difficult to break out of. And my rig is going to be compatible with yours, since heck, it's not even compatible with itself. Bottom line. So this is where you get all kinds of chicanery and cutthroatness, and wondering why nothing makes sense interiorly or exteriorly. And yeah, so from that original disorder comes disorder broadly, butterfly effect, as it were. You have um, the scientific phenomenon in chaos theory where, for example, the flapping of a butterfly's wings, small thing, affects long-term global weather patterns. The small becomes big. And if that's so, for a butterfly, well, what about a murder, let's say? The butterfly's flap flap doesn't really affect the moral order of things. It doesn't affect, it just does what it does. It's an animal, but a violation of the moral order has grave consequences for everything. And so that's where you get the double binds from. And it just multiplies. Once you have that first sin, the Catechism says after that first sin, I'm paraphrasing, the world is virtually inundated with sin. That's because, well, now we're confronted with a situation that is unnatural. Unnatural in the sense that, well, God didn't want it to be this way. And, but it is this way. And so we're sort of thrown into that. And we do the best we can until we can do better, by a miracle. But yeah, I just wanted to qualify that last point.
Okay. I think I'll start out, unless there's something else you want to say before we start reading.
I don't think so.
All right. So, okay, the beginning of the preface. The feeling of having no power over people and events is generally unbearable to us. When we feel helpless, we feel miserable. No one wants less... we're breaking up a bit. Did you get that first sentence? Did you get the first
Cut it
sentence?
again.
Okay.
Our viewers are patient because they're Christians, so they'll cut through this.
Okay. The feeling of having no power over people and events is generally unbearable to us. When we feel helpless, we feel miserable. No one wants less power. Everyone wants more. In the world today, however, it is dangerous to seem too power-hungry, to be overt with your power moves. We have to seem fair and decent, so we need to be subtle, congenial yet cunning, democratic yet devious. So one thing that I kind of realized on the second reading of this is that sort of has a relation to the idea of importance, right? Mm-hmm. So, in the original order, everyone was supposed to be well, and everyone was supposed to be the reason why everyone was well. So, there wouldn't be any, power in, the disordered sense, but, there'd be, a responsibility, being the reason why someone's doing well. And everyone, and since everyone's desires would be in harmony, if you wanted someone to do something, they would do it. Not because they were kind of acquiescing to what you wanted, but just because they already wanted to do it.
All the desires would cohere, in other words.
Yeah. So yeah. Trying to think if there's anything else. No. Well, yeah, I guess the idea of power, everyone kind of wants to carve out their own mini Garden of Eden because that's what that's what their minds are kind of oriented towards being in. So, they can't really rely on the justice kind of making itself. So they have to try to, force things to be just in a way. Did you get that?
You broke up again. I heard everyone wants to carve out their own mini Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Yep.
And since they can't rely on things to be just kind of as they are, they kind of have to force it to be in line with what they want to happen. So yeah, that's at least, from a Christian view of things, that would be the explanation for that kind of thing.
Yeah. We do
Yeah.
the best we can with what we have, and what we have is not very good if it's not quite what God would do, huh? So, we're left with the tools of hell to the degree that we're not doing it God's way. And that leads to hell. If you note, every utopian effort, for example, in history, has turned into a disaster. The more you consolidate power behind one of these efforts to make things just in human terms, not God's way, well, you bring a proportional disaster to the degree that you bring power to it. Every one of these efforts has ended up, either instantly imploding or killing millions of people. Interesting. They had good intentions, but didn't turn out so well.
Okay. This game of constant duplicity most resembles the power dynamic that existed in the scheming world of the old aristocratic court. Throughout history, the court has always formed itself around the person in power: king, queen, emperor, leader. The courtiers who filled this court were in an especially delicate position. They had to serve their masters, but if they seemed to fawn, if they curried favor too obviously, the other courtiers around them would notice and would act against them. Attempts to win the master's Okay.
You're breaking up hardcore.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Let's hope for a miracle.
I'll read the last kind of sentence over, and hopefully we can just do it this way. And it'll be slower, but hopefully we can make at least some progress.
Yeah.
They had to serve their masters, but if they seemed to fawn, if they curried favor too obviously, the other courtiers around them would notice and would act against them. Attempts to win the master's favor, then, had to be subtle, and even skilled courtiers, capable of such subtlety, still had to protect themselves from their fellow courtiers, who at all moments were scheming to push them aside. Meanwhile, the court was supposed to represent the height of civilization and refinement. Violent or overt power moves were frowned upon. Courtiers would work silently and secretly against any among them who used force. This was the courtier's dilemma. While appearing the very paragon of elegance, he had to outwit and thwart their own opponents, in the subtlest of ways. The successful courtier learned over time to make all of his moves indirect. If he stabbed an opponent in the back, it was with a velvet glove on his hand and the sweetest of smiles on his face. Instead of using coercion or outright treachery, the perfect courtier got his way through seduction, charm, deception, and subtle strategy, always planning several moves ahead. Life in the court was a never-ending game that required constant vigilance and tactical thinking. It was civilized war. Yeah, so that might, that little paragraph might illustrate the problems with trying to socially enforce a kind of politeness among people, because people are still going to be in conflict with one another, It's just that they'll have to be more like passive aggressive in the way that they kind of carry out their conflicts, which I guess is better than just outright aggression, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem.
Well, no, and it's also an example of the double binds I spoke of prior. Um, this subtle manipulation thing, white glove style. Well, where does it lead long term? It leads to open war. Hence open war. Where does it come from?
You were cutting off.
It comes from division and treachery that is
everything after open war. I couldn't hear.
Yeah, I was just saying, well, this is where open war comes from. It comes from the divisions in the individual human heart. All the sweetly veiled treachery is still treachery, and that's really murder in seed form. And eventually the mask comes off because it has to. It's just got a finite lifespan in terms of its ability to deceive, especially at a corporate level, against another corporate level entity doing the same thing, and it results in people killing each other. And when asked why, in the end, like World War I, for example, what the hell was that? Does anyone even know, really? But yeah, it happened, didn't it? Now look at this. Nobody gives a shit about anything that anybody was fighting for at all. It's like, what? Like all of that is completely just lost. Like it's incomprehensible.
Today we face a peculiarly similar paradox to that of the courtier. Everything must appear civilized, decent, democratic, and fair. But if we play by those rules too strictly, if we take them too literally, we are crushed by those around us who are not so foolish. As the great Renaissance diplomat and courtier Niccolo Machiavelli wrote, any man who tries to be good all the time is bound to come to ruin among the great number who are not good. The court imagined itself the pinnacle of refinement, but underneath its glittering surface, a cauldron of dark emotions, greed, envy, lust, hatred, boiled and simmered. Our world today similarly imagines itself as a pinnacle of fairness, yet the same ugly emotions still stir within us, as they have forever. The game is the same. Outwardly, you must seem to respect the niceties, but inwardly, unless you are a fool, you learn quickly to be prudent and to do as Napoleon advised. Place your iron hand inside a velvet glove. If, like the courtier of times gone by, you can master the arts of indirection, learning to seduce, charm, deceive, and subtly outmaneuver your opponents, you will attain the heights of power. You will be able to make people bend to your will without their realizing what you have done. And if they do not realize what you have done, they will neither resent nor resist you. This is a quote coming up from Lord Chesterfield. Quote, courts are, unquestionably, the seats of politeness and good breeding. Were they not so, they would be the seats of slaughter and desolation. Those who now smile upon and embrace would affront and stab each other if manners did not interpose. End quote. So it seems like more of what was talked about earlier, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Okay, going on. To some people, the notion of consciously playing power games, no matter how indirect, seems evil, asocial, a relic of the past. They believe they can opt out of the game by behaving in ways that have nothing to do with power. You must beware of such people, for while they express such opinions outwardly, they are often among the most adept players at power. They utilize strategies that cleverly disguise the nature of the manipulation involved. These types, for example, will often display their weakness and lack of power as a kind of moral virtue. But true powerlessness, without any motive of self-interest, would not publicize its weakness to gain sympathy or respect. Making a show of one's weakness is actually a very effective strategy, subtle and deceptive in the game of power. See Law 22, the surrender tactic. And next, coming next is a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. Quote, "There is nothing very odd about lambs disliking birds of prey, but this is no reason for holding it against large birds of prey that they carry off lambs. And when the lambs whisper among themselves, these birds of prey are evil, and does this not give us a right to say that whatever is the opposite of a bird of prey must be good? There is nothing intrinsically wrong with such an argument, though the birds of prey will look somewhat quizzically and say, 'We have nothing against these good lambs. In fact, we love them. Nothing tastes better than a tender lamb.'" End quote. So, obviously this is a kind of way of looking at things where you basically it's basically quantum minds theory. I don't think it'd be efficient to explain quantum minds theory over again. If you don't know what it is, New Apologetics has an article called "Refuting the Quantum Cosmological Argument," where it kind of explains quantum minds theory there. So I guess if you don't know what quantum minds theory is now, then go to the article, read that, and then come back once you've read it. But yeah, basically in QMT, the minds are kind of most basically in a form of competition with one another, and that's just what reality is at its most basic level. There's no real morality. It's all power. And that's kind of the way, that this is looking at things. But it also seems to be, again, in practicality, the way that people, on the most basic level would be acting in a kind of, in a fallen world. Because as we explained before, everyone is kind of hardwired to be well. And, people will be doing whatever they can to be well, even if it means manipulating people and not showing their true self and all that other stuff. Anything you want to
say? If you're done-ish with your initial exposition, I can talk. But
yeah, you can talk.
Just 2 points occurred to me, and we can discuss these now or later. Or a number of years ago, as a philosopher, I was entertaining this and that. Didn't have a worldview. What's the meaning of life? And there are all these different religious systems and spiritual quests, and I say spiritual in the same sense that Nietzsche has a certain view of how to ascend and whatnot. Basically, how to get from not in the right place to the right place, whatever that right place is. And it occurred to me one day, if God exists,
and by the way, just sorry to interrupt, but it just occurred to me that it seems that it would make sense on the kind of Christian view that we just proposed, that people would know that we're not in the right place, but they wouldn't necessarily, maybe it would be predicted that, everyone would know that something's wrong, but they maybe wouldn't be quite so sure what is wrong. And so, there would be all these different systems that try to come up with some way out and some kind of proposition about what the problem is.
Right. So, there are all these different systems. They say you have to do thus and such in order to be thus and such, and it's better to be thus and such than where you were. And a lot of the doings are very hard. You have to be really kind of smart and diligent, and you have to apply yourself. Um, Pretty much for just about all of them that are out there. And what occurred to me is, well, if God exists, in the sense that God, as the Catholic Church would have it, then the meaning of life, whatever it is, it has to be available equally so to the poor and disabled and the mentally retarded as much as it is for Friedrich Nietzsche or any philosopher or ardent spiritual practitioner. And if it isn't like that, then there is no meaning to life because you've just dismissed a huge segment of the population. And so if there's meaning for your life but not theirs, and you're all human beings, there's really no meaning at all. You're just making shit up at that point, and victimizing the helpless to do it. So that was point one. That realization made a bit of an impression on me. Point two, as you were talking about Machiavelli there, whatnot, you talk in the quote anyway. You mentioned like something to the effect of, enjoy the benefits of power, true power. Notice though that what he's talking about, even in its best case scenario, is not an instance of true freedom. In other words, nobody, if they had their druthers, free will, not under any constraint, would opt to enact Machiavelli's shit sandwich view of things. In other words, if you had your way with true power, you wouldn't have to deal with that. You wouldn't have to worry. You wouldn't have to be looking over your shoulder. You wouldn't have to manipulate anybody, would you? So Machiavelli's view of it, and all who are like him, it's intrinsically self-destroying, because even on its own terms, best case scenario, it can't succeed. You can't really have true power that is also a slavery. In other words, it's not truly free. You're immediately and permanently compromised as soon as you take it up as a goal. So is there a kind of power that's consonant with human free will? Free will being where any authentic human energy comes from. Whatever is not done by a person's free will is not done with their authentic humanity, is it? They would do differently if they had the power to do so, wouldn't they? And so why are they doing as they are? Well, it's because, hey, they don't have that power. And so if this is the best power that people have to offer who like to talk about power, then that's a deal, isn't it?
Yeah. And the quote again, any man who tries to be good all the time is bound to come to ruin among the great number who are not good.
Yeah. Yeah, he's already come to ruin with that statement. So.
All right. I'm going to keep going unless you want to say something else.
No, I'm good.
All right. Another strategy of the supposed non-player is to demand equality in every area of life. Everyone must be treated alike, whatever their status and strength. But if, to avoid the taint of power, you attempt to treat everyone equally and fairly, you will confront the problem that some people do certain things better than others. Treating everyone equally means ignoring their differences, elevating the less skillful, and suppressing those who excel. Again, many of those who behave this way are actually deploying another power strategy, redistributing people's rewards in a way that they determine. Do you want to say anything just about that paragraph?
Not yet. Go on.
Yeah. Yet another way of avoiding the game would be perfect honesty and straightforwardness, since one of the main techniques of those who seek power is deceit and secrecy. But being perfectly honest will inevitably hurt and insult a great many people, some of whom will choose to injure you in return. No one will see your honest statement as completely objective, and free of some personal motivation. And they will be right. In truth, the use of honesty is indeed a power strategy, intended to convince people of one's noble, good-hearted, selfless character. It is a form of persuasion, even a subtle form of coercion. Finally, those who claim to be non-players may affect an air of naivete to protect them from the accusation that they are after power. Beware again, however, for the appearance of naivete can be an effective means of deceit. See Law 21, seem dumber than you mark. And even genuine naivete is not free of the snares of power. Children may be naive in many ways, but they often act from an elemental need to gain control over those around them. Children suffer greatly from feeling powerless in the adult world, and they use any means available to get their way. Genuinely innocent people may still be playing for power and are often horribly effective at the game, since they are not hindered by reflection. Once again, those who make a show or display of innocence are the least innocent of all. And here's a quote from Johann von Goethe, I think.
Was
Goethe.
I don't know.
Quote, the only means to gain one's ends with people are force and cunning. Love also, they say, but that is to wait for sunshine, and life needs every moment. End quote. So yeah, so the claim is that, someone who claims / tries to not play the power game are kind of doing it anyway, just in a more subtle and possibly effective way.
Mm-hmm.
And, I guess this is something that we could say happens apart from grace, like apart from, like we can't handle suffering properly without faith, hope, without grace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say about what I've just read?
Yeah, I'm going to say something totally crazy by most common sense standards, but it's also provable by, logic. Or whatever you want to call it, my self-deception or my deception of the audience here, just for my own power game. Let's just look at a simple little argument here. Preface to the argument. What if it were the case that all the failure, all the lack, all the disorder, all the variety we experience were generated metaphysically by our efforts to avoid, mitigate, circumnavigate possible failure? What if? What if the whole thing just came from itself trying to avoid itself like that? That would be wild, wouldn't it? And what if that whole enchilada, you could just pull the plug from it by simply pulling the plug from it, not participating? And what if that non-participation were metaphysically, factually, no, really, what if it were a participation in God's own omnipotence and omniscience in a co-acting kind of sense? Namely, you know what you need to know, and you accomplish what you need to accomplish apropos of your place in the community of persons, such that the desire of your heart is fulfilled, and you can't fail to disappoint all those who are coherently...
Can't fail to disappoint.
Can't fail. What if? It's a crazy proposal, but let's just look at a little something. Because, I like to crazy talk sometimes. These people say that. All right, so absolute perfection, right? God and, people who are co-acting with God, absolute perfection. So absolute perfection, when it acts, it can't really fail. So, because it's absolute perfection. So it doesn't have to try to not fail. It just, by being itself, it rocks. It can't miss. So look at this. If it is not the case that absolute perfection is acting, then the action is possibly a defense against the possibility of failure. Simple. Okay, premise one. That's premise one. If it is not the case that it's absolute perfection acting, then the action is possibly a defense against the possibility of failure. Okay, that's premise one of my argument. Premise two is the conclusion. All right, it's the contrapositive of premise one, logical equivalent. You take the antecedent and the consequent, you flip them and you negate both. Therefore, if it is not the case that the action is possibly a defense against the possibility of failure, then absolute perfection is acting. Boom. Okay, so all the stuff that our author has talked about here is not only possibly a defense against the possibility of failure. I mean, man, if the possibility of failure is the bait, right? Avoiding that, the possibility of failure is the bait, then this guy, eats the naked hook and the whole Spanish Armada, doesn't he? Oh my God, it's just like, this is what life's about, avoiding possible failure. Well, fucking A, no. If you drop that, you're co-acting with God, man. You get all the power there is.
So
now, that was a deductive argument. Okay, first premise is a no-brainer. Second premise, but the conclusion is the logical equivalent of the first. Where did I miss, man? It's too simple.
okay, so there are two things I wanted to say. I think I'll start with the one that I am now in danger of maybe forgetting. You mentioned, like, right at the start of that, what if all the lack and all that stuff is based on, trying to avoid it? I guess, what would you, say to those watching who think that's too reminiscent of a kind of, like, prosperity gospel kind of thing? Where, like, oh, if you just stop trying to avoid possible failure, then you can get your Mercedes and all that crap. Is that kind of thing entailed by what you just said?
No, because it may not be right for you to have a Mercedes, but you'll get what you need. I'll tell you that. What you need might not be what you think you need either. But you'll start to see stuff that you didn't see before. You'll start to see, oh man, there's really something to this. You'll see a providence. And you'll see a providence tailored to your own heart, your own authentic heart. And not because I say so, but because you'll see it for yourself. And it doesn't really matter how close this sounds to an aberrant form of the gospel. There's some truth to every aberration, prosperity gospel included. It doesn't matter because, again, it's not my opinion. I just gave a deductive argument. It's a friggin' two-step argument. First premise, necessary. Second premise is the equivalent of the first. What more can I say?
Okay,
How much what can be made, It's funny, when you have these knockdown arguments, people think you're playing a trick on them because it's like, there's two kinds of objections. There's objections because somebody has an objection, and then there's, like, the objection that comes when the thing makes so much sense that your interlocutor gives up on being able to assess the argument, and they think that you're an asshole because you made the argument. I'm used to the second kind, oddly enough, and
hopefully I can provide something like the first time here. So, the action. Let's just take a situation.
right.
I'll make something up.
Yeah.
I want you to do a video chat with me but you don't want to. And if you chose to do so, then you'd be acting against the possibility that I would be pissed off at you. So the action not to avoid possible failure is to not do it.
Yep.
Um, the problem though is that if you think about just the action of refusing to do a video chat with me, is it the case that that isn't possibly an action to avoid possible failure? It doesn't seem like that.
Well, I'm having a good time here. I'm having fun. I'm playing.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm not worried. If it sucks, it sucks, and it doesn't suck so far. Amazingly, even the breakups cleared up. Uh, but point being, you kind of know. You know when you just know in your heart. Like when you're playing, it's not about dodging a bullet. And it really kind of comes down to that. So a lot of people do a lot of things because they're afraid of what somebody else is going to do if they don't, or they're afraid of what somebody else is not going to do if they don't. And that's interesting enough. That's the wrong motive. That's a motive that's at odds with true love.
Okay.
True love not being based on a fear of disappointing somebody or how to dodge a threat, but true love being based all and entirely on, guess what? True love, which is something other than avoiding possible failure.
Yeah, so the conclusion...
Pause. The Bible says love never fails. Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not just this lovey-dovey tripe that St. Paul wanted to push. Metaphysics stuff.
So okay, the conclusion that we would want to derive that would be more applicable is if something isn't a defense against possible failure in terms of like motivation, then it's absolute perfection acting.
Yeah.
But then if we try to take the contrapositive of that, then it becomes if absolute perfection is not acting,
if it's not
then
the case,
action is in terms of motivation about resisting possible failure.
Yeah, or at least
that's a lot less obvious than the kind of way that you were trying to get premise one of this original argument to work.
Well, premise one was that. Premise one was
no, it's not. It's not the same thing because you're trying to use the modal terminology, possibly, about resisting failure.
Yeah, I guess so. I went for the more strict version, just because you can get away with that. But yeah, if you wanted to do it your way, it's the same thing. It's just less evident of a first premise. You can get the first premise to be sure as can be, at least by my lights, with the modal formulation. But it can probably be improved too.
Well, maybe there's. I'm thinking of maybe a way of improving it. That would be kind of based on. It would be based on the kind of like original sin psychology that what you were talking about. So it's not as broadly applicable, but I think it might be more. It might actually work better than the original. So, in the fallen world, we're in like a situation where naturally we're just acting to resist possible failure, possible evil, whatever else. But God, if he, the true thing that we can, the premise that I think is a lot less controversial is if it is absolute if it is absolute perfection acting, then it is not a defense against possible failure, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
God doesn't like change in response to the threat of evil.
Right.
So if there's some way, I guess this might not be. This might not actually be logically valid.
You run a tight ship, man.
But if we, if we like encounter someone who is not acting, to avoid possible failure, then again, I don't think this is logically valid, but hopefully it's at least a good like inference to say that, well, this is, since that's not really something that happens naturally, that it's something that absolute perfection, co-acting with absolute perfection would be doing, would, not acting to avoid possible failure.
Kids do it before they get screwed up by their parents. I got to tell you,
even if someone, even if parents raise children knowing all of this stuff, the child still like suffers, and the child, would still be, they'd still want to avoid suffering, so they'd still act to avoid possible failure, even if that wasn't a thing, right?
Yeah, it happens. For sure. The world is a mess, and we get compromised. However, most of the compromise comes from, guess what? Parents trying to raise their children to, guess what? To not fail according to thus and such thing. And this makes them what? Fail like crazy and cause all kinds of disorder. If you just let them be and you're there for them and you listen to them like human beings, because they are, be amazed at what happens. Be amazed. They speak for God in a lot of cases, at least in my experience. You just got to be listening. And, one of the biggest curses upon children is parents trying to raise them, instead of just hanging out. I've been doing spiritual direction pretty much full time, like 24/7 for like 5 or 6 years now. And just about everyone who comes to me has been, royally effed by their parents. The parents unwittingly doing this, okay? They're not trying to abuse people. But people of all different backgrounds and ages, just torn to pieces by the demands that their parents have placed on them. And, they're psychological Swiss cheese because of it. And it's almost impossible to get a person to break free from that, because it's scary. It's scary to fill in those gaps and break those deals, especially when you've made your safety out of not filling in the gaps and not breaking the deals, And the same goes for the parents. How did they get that way? Well, they got that way from their parents and down the line, all the way to the first parents, as it were. And, trickle down effect of all manner of effery. And, yeah.
All right. I think I can go on now.
All right.
You can recognize these supposed non-players by the way they flaunt their moral qualities, their piety, their exquisite sense of justice. But since all of us hunger for power, and almost all of our actions are aimed at gaining it, I'll just repeat that sentence since you were breaking up. Unless you just heard through.
I heard it was okay.
Okay. But since all of us hunger for power, and almost all of our actions are aimed at gaining it, the non-players are merely throwing dust in our eyes, distracting us from their power plays with their air of moral superiority. If you observe them closely, you will see in fact that they are often the ones most skillful at indirect manipulation, even if some of them practice it unconsciously, and they greatly resent any publicizing of the tactics they use every day. And here's a quote from Kautsila, Indian philosopher, 3rd century BC. Quote, the arrow shot by the archer may or may not kill a single person, but the stratagems devised by a wise man can kill even babies in the womb, end quote. If the world is like a giant scheming court and we are trapped inside it, there's no use in trying to opt out of the game. That will only render you powerless, and powerlessness will make you miserable. Instead of struggling against the inevitable, instead of arguing and whining and feeling guilty, it is far better to excel at power. In fact, the better you are at dealing with power, the better friend, lover, husband, wife, and person you become. By following the route of the perfect courtier, see Law 24, you learn to make others feel better about themselves, becoming a source of pleasure to them. They will grow dependent on your abilities and desirous of your presence. By mastering the 48 laws in this book, you spare others the pain that comes from bundling with power, by playing with fire without knowing its properties. If the game of power is inescapable, better to be an artist than a denier or a bungler. So, yeah. There's, I have some notes on, like, the paragraphs coming up. They're going to be pretty interesting, I think. But anything you want to say about what I just read off those last couple of paragraphs?
Yeah, gosh, I hope the author doesn't really think so. Because, like, as I'm putting my head there, man, that's a casket full of worms. It's like the lights go out and everything becomes like this black cotton candy that I don't want to eat.
QMT.
Huh?
QMT.
QMT, baby, all the way.
I think, I was just thinking, maybe, like, if Nietzsche were alive today and he, like, read the QMT, like, maybe he'd actually, like, believe it. Like, maybe
I wonder, because QMT is more Nietzsche than Nietzsche, right?
Yeah.
And so much so that I don't think anyone would ever sign on to it just because it's so damn ugly.
There was a video I was watching on The Will to Power, and it kind of like it's as if it is QMT, but he just didn't have like the words to kind of express it.
Yeah, on QMT, you don't even exist really as an agent. You're a collection of minds at the quantum level that have made an alliance, provisionally, as long as that's good enough for now, in order to gain power over these other minds. And within that alliance, things can go ape shit as well. Get a cancer or whatever. Those are certain minds rebelling against your little alliance. Long story there, but man, it's a dastardly ugly model, and it's a little far too explanatory for I think anybody's taste. And just about any ardent power luster like our author here might be, or Machiavelli or whatever, would be growing wool and bleeding, begging for something other than QMT to be true. I suspect. I can't say so yet. I've just never seen anybody latch on to it, even though it explains all the data better than their atheism does. Oh man! All right, let's break here just for the viewers, not being assailed by a 2-hour talk, and we can pick up in the next segment. Agreed?
Are we just gonna have the next segment still tonight, or like some other day?
Whenever you want.
Okay. I'd rather have it tonight, but
all right.
If you're tired, then you can go to sleep.
I'm not saying I'm tired, but whenever I send you a 3-hour talk, you always ignore me for months, and I want more influence. I'm sure you do too, because
I've listened through some of I think I listened through all of the Kalam hangout that was like a few years ago. So
yeah.
If it's up there, then you can listen to it whenever you want.
Yeah, let's break here.
Okay.
Go, have a smoke or whatever, and we'll come back.
Okay.
God willing, hopefully I'll have a better connection, and
Yeah, good stuff so far. Thank you.
All right.